and new conversations that we have within this field of work. We hope you enjoy our presentation, and let's begin.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you to our predecessors on the land and to WNPS for hosting this conversation. We're going to start by going through the project process as it happened, and we'll have some glimpses of some windows that were opening through the process as time went on, but it really was toward the, interestingly, toward the end, what would be conventionally considered the end of the project, being the installation, which is actually the beginning, that a lot of my mind-blowing lessons really started to impact me. And things really started to gel between us toward the later phases of the project. So we'll go through the project process and we'll each be chiming in about what we were doing and interacting. And then toward the end of this talk, or the later part of the talk, we're going to be sharing some lessons and discussing those. So it's great to start with this image of this beautiful building by Olsen Kundig, the architects. When we came onto the project, there was already an extraordinary idea of deboxing the Natural History Museum, making the collections open and transparent for people to see as part of the place where they live today. So the question for us was how do we pull that idea into the landscape? And I have some crummy cartoons to show on the next slide. There we go. So the big idea that we started with, it was we were just getting our toes into this project. These are some whiteboard cartoons talking about how excited we were to think differently about a museum landscape that people could learn from. So there's certainly a tradition of botanical gardens and ethnobotanical gardens that we fully respect, but they tend to have individual specimens, plants that are isolated. You can see them with air around them, and then there's an individual, often an individual sign telling you what that plant is. Well, on the bottom here, that bottom crummy cartoon, talks about the idea of being inspired by the Burke's vision, led by Julie Stein and Polly and the entire team, the Council of Elders, of opening up the Burke, opening up natural history and culture so that people are simply experiencing it. So it's thinking the landscape outside of the Burke, there's preserved specimens and all sorts of endlessly interesting things inside. But outside, you're in a living landscape, a landscape that's living right now with people right now who can tell you and teach you and interact with you to help you understand where you live and the ecology and cultural connections there. And it's this basic idea of this full color sensory experience that's in the now, and it reminding you that natural history and culture is in the present today. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Bridget.
Thank you. So we at Oxbow, we got involved in 2015. And, you know, at that point where we were, as a donation to the Burke, going to grow many of the plants for the project. And so we got Shannon's list, and we were so excited just because it was so unique compared to other landscapes that you see in the city. And so our kind of first order of business, even though, so the landscape was installed in fall, winter 2019. So even though we had over 4 years, 4 seasons, we knew that we had to get started because what we wanted to do was grow most of the plants, all that we could, from seed. And we made that decision. We grow most of our plants from seed at Oxbow because we want to create, or not create, but we want to grow a genetically diverse crop. So we want all of our plants to be a little bit different from their neighbors, a little bit different from their relatives, so that they hold this range of possibility for now, as they're in there, and you'll kind of see some pictures of what it looks like now, and into the future. And so in order to get the seed, we did some collections over the 4 years in the Snoqualmie Valley, where Oxbow is. We're located in Carnation, near the Snoqualmie River. And so we did a lot of collections there for some of the forest species. We got to go on a special collection trip to get some of the prairie species, like the beautiful Camas you see here, from a small island in the San Juans. And you know, some seed we needed to purchase in, and our efforts were to get as much seed as we could from the state of Washington, since we were growing these plants for the state's Natural History Museum. One of the things a lot of people don't really think about, we live in this society that, you know, we can order whatever we want, whenever we want it, from Amazon, and people don't think about the timetable that it takes to grow a plant like Camas to put on the landscape. If you could click one forward, Shannon. One of the, you know, kind of keystone plants that in this landscape is Camas. We grew 2 different species of Camas, and in that upper picture in the corner, you can see the seed pods that the seed ripens, and it's these beautiful black seeds ready in the middle of the summer. And so that summer we knew, because this is a very long species to grow up from seed, we knew we had to collect some of our bulb species that summer. So getting things going in enough time to get them ready for 2019, so we got off to a running start there. One of the things a lot of people don't know about growing native plants and growing plants in general, that sometimes seed can be a real bottleneck. It's not something that's you know, similar, like vegetables, seeds, they have been bred, and, you know, there's lots of companies selling them. There's not a lot of people selling native seeds. And so getting seed is often a bottleneck for these projects. And so the fact that we were able to, we had places where we could collect them, collect the seed to get started, helped us with this. And then there's several people in the state of Washington that we were able to purchase seed from. But as time goes on, it is just an important question that I want to, you know, it's worth noting. This is an issue, you know, if we're taking seeds out of the wild, we have to know that there's other things that need these seeds besides our restoration projects. The plant itself needs the seed in order to reproduce and still exist in the area where it is. It might be something that's harvested for food or medicine by indigenous people. We need to make sure there's enough for that. There's animals who eat seed. We need to make sure there's enough for them. And so there's a lot of considerations and a lot of knowledge of the plant that you need to kind of make sure that you have before you go into seed collection. And so from the very start, you know, some of the plants were new to us, and so we spent kind of a deep dive getting in to make sure that we would be able to grow them and have seed that was responsibly collected. If you click to the next picture, this is a picture of the Camas meadow part of the Burke landscape, and this was taken this spring. So these are, you know, kind of all of our little babies, and some of them are just getting started, and some of them were some of our pioneer species that look a little bit more vigorous. But the landscape as a total is pretty impressive. There's over 80,000 plants total, and Oxbow provided about 70,000 of them. I went and counted all my different lists, and I got 52 different species on the landscape, which is really impressive. And so just sort of kind of keeping track of the timetables and the seed to get all of this started was from the very beginning complicated, but a kind of welcome challenge to us. And I think Shannon's going to continue from here.
So I'm going to pick back up on the landscape architecture track on this project. Our firm, we tend to, we earnestly pride ourselves in looking at each site as deeply as we can into the history and context, and to try to make each design as much as sort of repair and reconnect as we can. We get a lot of inspiration from doing what we call site analysis. This project, what I came out of it with was just a magnified times 100 sense of awe of how little of the true giant truth of the site we can really get from our conventionally available resources of Western science. Explorer, starts with the Explorer journals and sketches. And there was one conversation with Polly where I think she used a term that was quite similar to the giant truth. There's a giant truth that so dwarfs the amount of information. And in the Seattle area, we're talking about less than 200 years of so-called documented, at least where we tend to look, documented history. And yet under our feet, in the soil, all around us, is this thousands-year-old truth of what this place really is underneath this thin veneer of recent transformation. So I just want to emphasize that I think we all know that, but sometimes you need that sort of like, the universe poster with like, you are here, to just remind us of how ridiculous it is that we don't, our site analyses and our sense of what the history is of a site get distorted by, in a proportion, by our lack of, and maybe it's not lack of access, maybe it's lack of looking in the right places for that information. So here we have a place that had thousands of years of cultural and natural history, where our Washington State History and Culture Museum is going. So a challenge, and one that I sort of became more aware of as time went on. But here, this is the red is the outline of our site in the area. It's a wonderful place to have a museum of history and culture. Here we see the natural, and I'd also say cultural, pre-settler landform here. We're on a high ridge with Indianola sandy soil, one of those outcrops in Seattle, a north-south oriented valley and ridge. And of course, that is what gives form to what we look at when we look at the history of the U District as Brooklyn, with this north-south oriented streetcar line. And then as landscape architects trying to get our heads into the scale of this unbroken, it was called the mantle of green, the great mantle of green, this unbroken ecosystem and cultural landscape that stretched without roads and dividers and major cutoffs. We do know about this site. One of the cool things about this site, it still has its thousands-year-old history in the soil. There are madrona seedlings coming up. We know what's associated with that and what's associated with these soils that are still found in the site, and I'll show you why in a second. We have that community of San Juan Islandy, crackly, dry forest, including plants that I've always thought of as, oh, these plants are a community together, and maybe they're also a community with insects, but there's a cultural and human layer to that. That's, I'm only just starting to appreciate in its depth. And I'll hand it to Polly for this.
Thank you. My role as a tribal liaison is to assist with projects within the Burke Museum to bring in tribal communities to provide information and support projects that are happening. I was brought onto the project in 2019. There is a question in the chat that asked, when did this project what is the time frame of this project? And we actually talked about it as a panelist. And Shannon started the project in 2012, started designing the yard and started working on what was going in. Bridget and Oxbow were brought in 2015. And then as we got closer to the planting, and I've been at the Burke for a couple of years, the question came up, can we engage with the tribes and have them involved in any of this process, and would they be interested? So I'm a food gatherer as well. I need to be reintroduced to the Camas. And so looking at the history of the food gathering techniques within tribal communities, but also talking to tribal food gatherers from around the state of Washington and region and asking them if they would like to be involved. This is a recent photo of the community going out and gathering camas today in a contemporary time. Next photo, please. Our food gathering practices have been going on since time immemorial. And so these traditions are shared through stories, through gathering in community, through conversations and sharing resources with other tribal communities. This was a commodity: 1, to feed your family; 2, to trade for resources; 3, to help the land stay rejuvenated and being able to produce, but yet not get crowded or overgrown. There was a relationship between us, our tribal communities, our presence, and the land. It is a relationship of reciprocity and respect. We give offerings, we sing our songs, we offer some of the other old teachings, and then the earth gives back to us in a good way to take care of our ceremonial tables as well as our families and communities. Next slide. I'm gonna give this to Bridget.
And so as we were getting started with nurturing these seeds that we had gathered and learning about these plants, many of which were new to us, we really, Camas, like I said, really became a big focal point I forgot to mention earlier, of the 70,000 plants that we grew, about 14,000 of them were Camas. And so it's a big part of the landscape. And, we're thinking about it as like, oh, how come people don't plant this in their gardens? Or how come we don't use this more in ecological restoration? But as Polly said, thinking of it more in terms of a being, something that we can have a relationship with, like humans have had for thousands of years. If you move to the next slide, when white settlers first came to this region, and there's many areas where they were greeted with this beautiful scene, and there's a lot of writings of, we know Alki Point in Seattle is one of the places the Denny family came and eventually built a cabin. And here in the Snoqualmie Valley where I am, there's a spot where there was a prairie that John Muir wrote about as he traveled through the area. And when I say we, meaning non-Indigenous people, we know now that these landscapes were not just wild landscapes like this. They were managed, and they were managed using an incredible level of technology and genius, honed over thousands of years of observation and care, and to provide these important staple foods for the people that lived here and had that relationship of reciprocity with them. If you skip to the next slide, what unfortunately a lot of people saw when they got here was, this is a land of trees, trees, trees everywhere. And wherever there was these nice open prairies, that was a good place to build your house. That was a good place to start your farm. That was a good place to graze your animals. And, you know, to all of our great dismay, you know, within a span of maybe 50 years or so, almost all of these sacred lands were destroyed. And I think an important kind of shift in my mind as I went through this process was thinking about we, and I say we as, you know, native plant enthusiasts and lovers and professionals look at something, you know, a picture like this and think of how sad, you know, it's a devastating loss of biodiversity. It's a devastating ecological, you know, change in ecological function. But the additional thing to remember is it's also a devastating loss of a deep relationship with the land, and a devastating loss of land management techniques that were put in place that, you know, that allowed the existence of these plants indefinitely into the future. And so as we work to kind of reverse this, it's important to remember that relationship needs to be part as we try to move things back along the way. And I'll turn it over to Shannon from here.
Thanks, Bridget. I just wanted to say on this image, I used to say, oh, that was so terrible. How could they do that? And then I've realized we are still colonizing the landscape. And I have been colonizing the landscape in the way I've been planting in my work. I'm setting my cows loose, and, you know, we see it all around us. Still happening in this really recently, you know, more recently colonized region and right around us. And that is the segue into the modern history, which we were, it's much easier, I guess, more convenient for some of us to find about our sites. And again, this is being such a well-suited, unusual site to contain those hints of natural history and culture today and in the past for our state's Natural History and Culture Museum. This is the UW campus. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the UW campus is kind of this green quadrant of the U District, and 15th Avenue is this line between this sylvan, lots of trees and, you know, a traditional beautiful campus. And then this northwest corner actually wasn't developed, as we call developed. It wasn't paved over and buildings weren't put there until fairly recently, and really until mid-century, which explains these seeds that are still there in the soil. So here we see, this is a 1960 photo, the parking revolution of society sort of joyously took over a lot of things, including paving over there. But it was the first time that pavement sealed in the life in this site to some degree, and it really couldn't contain it. But here we see the diagram we started with. The Burke Museum was this closed brick box with a donut of parking around it. And the basic idea of the project, which again was there when we started, was the building was moved to the edge so that you really had the opportunity for a new university quad. There's an open space in the center right now. It's still allocated to parking, but we don't think that's going to be forever. And the building becomes more accessible and visible on 15th. History and culture is part of today. Indigenous history and culture is part of today's city. So there's a lot of things about that that are really important. And then you see this blue rectangle with steps, and that's the Camas meadow that we're focusing on today, because Camas is such a central, important kind of plant for us to all start understanding these ancient agreements that are embedded in this plant that I had been proudly using as a native ornamental in recent years. And here you see those steps, and again, planted in December. Here we see all these young plants coming up that were lovingly grown by seed in the first quiet COVID, unfortunately, season of its existence. And then you see Fraxinus latifolia, Oregon ash trees, next to an art installation by the Chinook Nation artists that hadn't been installed yet here, but represents the canoe paddles up, a gesture of peaceful arrival that's been installed there. Paddles tended to be made from this tree. So there's this agreement between the tree and the art that's represented there. Hopefully you can go see it soon, and the Burke is reopening soon. I should also mention to the public September 22nd. Back to Bridget.
Yay, we're all excited about the Burke opening for sure. So again, like as I mentioned, 80,000 plants in the landscape. One of the things that was really exciting about this design and about the knowledge that GGN brought to this, this plant palette wouldn't have been there without their having worked with or / wanted to work with these plants for many years, and advocating for them. I just threw a few. That the first picture at the top is chocolate lily fritillaria affinis, that's an actual picture from the Burke this spring. In the middle, I don't like this name, False Lily of the Valley. We need to change that name. It's a cute little forest understory in the foresty parts of the landscape there. And then Allium acuminatum, which is taper tip onion, and one of our native onions, just with this really brilliant bright pink blooms in the late spring. And so we're super excited to get to work with some of these plants that were new to us. You can go to the next slide. And I just wanted to kind of point out, it was really neat. We have at our nursery new people coming in every year. And so because a lot of these plants, this is Salal right here, and because some of them take 2 years or 3 years or 4 years to get up to size, the plants kind of were handled and tended to by a series of plant lovers over the years. And so to think of all of the people that put their love into those plants and that they're now out on the landscape for all of us to love is really neat, I think. You can go to the next slide. A lot of the species that we grew, the big picture is one of our native sedums, Sedum spaculifolium, and then some of the nursery crew there are working with one of the Camas meadow plants that bloomed this year. It's called a showy fleabane, and Erigeron speciosus. And one of the things that we just noticed in growing plants from seed is we got quite a diversity, and we tried to preserve that diversity. I think a lot of times when you're growing things production wise, you're sort of like, maybe I have 200, plants or seeds that I've sown. I need 50 plants. I'm just going to take the first 50 that germinate, and those must be the best ones, and we're going to move on. But we tried it at every step of the way to choose diversity. And so if there was some early germinators and some late germinators, all of those, we'd sort of mix them all up, and those would go forward together. If there were some that grew taller and some that were shorter, we would use all of that diversity in there because we wanted that to be represented in the final landscape. We don't know what future conditions will be like. We don't know what challenges might greet these plants in the future. And so the fact that they all have a little bit different traits make them more resilient in future conditions. And the way that the Camas meadow is planted is really set up to allow for change to happen over time. You know, like Shannon said, it was 2019 wasn't the end, it was the beginning. You know, things are going to change over time. You know, some plants are short-lived, some are long-lived, some will easily seed and there'll be more babies of them. There will be harvesting, you know, there will be human interaction. So it's set up to be dynamic, and we really tried to do that by the way that we grew the plants. Let's see.
I have to add, they're also cooler looking.
Yeah, yes.
They really are. For the designers there, the authenticity of having personalities and that diversity.
Right. Yeah. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. And just again, it's like this thing in our culture, we value uniformity and perfection, and everybody wants like this thing that looks exactly right, but that's not real. That's not how the world works. Let's see, you can click to the next slide. Some of the plants that we really enjoyed and got to know, this is sickle-keeled lupin, Lupinus albicollis, which you'll see in some later pictures. It was a very early superstar in the garden this year, and is helping things get started there. And then if you click to the next slide, this is one of my most favorite native plants, Allium sternum, another one of our native onions. It's called nodding onion because it nods over like that. And it's just, I think it's just got it all. It's really cute. It's got a beautiful bloom. They're edible. They're easy to grow, beloved by animals and human animals alike. So one of the things that in the native plant world is there's a lot of the species that maybe people are interested in or are culturally important or ecologically important. It's not widely known how to grow them. And so there's not like somewhere you can easily look up, here's how I grow this plant. And so one of the things that we really worked with as we grew these plants was kind of documenting what we're doing so that we can get this information out in various contexts to help it be easier for other people, and so that other nurseries can grow more of these plants as enthusiasm and relationships with them build.
You hear all the time how hard these are to grow.
Yes. Yeah. And some of them are and some of them aren't. And some of them would be easy if someone just, gave you this one little easy tip. So we're hoping to be able to, facilitate that in some way of sharing that information. And I'll pass it over to Polly.
So now we have caught up. We are getting ready to move our plants to the Burke yard. You've heard the stories of the plants and how they've been propagated and cared for throughout. The team asked if we could, like I said earlier, speak to tribal communities and come in and share some words or do something with the plants as we move forward. So I contacted our Native American Advisory Board at the Burke Museum and asked if people would like to be involved and come to the farm and help us introduce ourselves to the plants and welcome them, prepare a relationship, begin a relationship with them as they move to the Burke Museum. We had 5 tribal communities join us in this, we called it Blessing of the Plant Ceremony. We went out to Oxbow Farm. We had Snoqualmie, whose land the plants were being cared for and growing as little infants to jubies. And we had Wanapum tribe with us, Yakimas, Puyallups, Suquamish, and they showed up and we gathered around, we toured around the nursery, and we talked about how the work was being done with the plants. And then we came together as a group and we, some of our tribes shared traditional stories around relationship between plants and animals. There were stories of rabbit and their need for some of these plants. We sung songs and we told stories. We invited food gatherers in as well from the east side. I would say that all the tribes and all of us individuals as food gatherers and tribes are at different places in our relationship and access to the Camas food. And so what we are talking about is how can we generate knowledge? How can we share and teach each other as tribal communities how to bring this food back to our ceremonial tables, into our ceremonial practices, as we have done since time immemorial. The relationship is to heal. We intend and we want to heal. And so we had a variety of knowledge keepers and food gatherers who knew some of the stories, and we had a really interesting experience. Next slide. We blessed and we shared stories. This is Connie McLeod in the red shirt. Connie was at both ceremonies, and she was really amazing because she shared that the land remembers what was here, and that it is excited to have our foods come back, and that we are returning it. She called it, Shannon, restoration?
Yes, I took deep note of her using that term. Thank you.
Yeah, and with these words, we're just talking about our reintroduction, our reconnection, and our ability to see the plants in a way that we have maybe forgotten or maybe weren't aware that it was standing side by side with us. It is important for us to remember that we have a very long and old relationship with the plants. So bringing the elders in to speak to this was really powerful for Oxbow and for Oxbow's board. I mean, all the participants that came to this event. Next slide. And we learned lessons. I'm not ready to go into lessons, but the food gatherers they had to step back and they had to take care of themselves. I personally walk in two worlds. I walk in the world of academia and where I sit, but I also work as in the world of a traditionalist. I am a non-traditional traditionalist. I know my traditions and my practices, but I also have to accommodate. So in the urgency and how quickly this project was moving and how quickly I had to prepare and take care of the cultural practices that I believe were important to this project, to do this work in a good way, to start the relationships with the tribes, I moved too fast. I did not take proper time to prepare the elders in the way that they were going to see the foods in these containers. They called them test tubes. And so the elders had to really sit back and process and understand and change their type of thinking and how they felt they could move forward with this project. And so we finished the first layer of the first segment of these ceremonies out at Oxbow Farm. And we paused and we took a break. We needed to figure out when the weather was going to allow us to move them to the new Burke yard. But in the meantime, between this October event, October of 19 to April, is that right around there? March-ish?
Yes, March.
Thanks, Bridget. I had a lot of work to do, personal journey to figure out the harm that I had created, but also figure out and be really aware of how to address the bridging of two cultures, how to address and bring the two communities together. There were the three communities, the plants, Shannon and her team, Bridget and her team, as well as the Burke along in this work. And so this was where really a lot of really deep, honest, authentic conversations started to happen about relationship, about how the foods and the plants are going to be used and how they're going to relate into the work as we move forward. I will now pass this back to Bridget.
Yeah, I think either of us could talk about this, right? Meanwhile, unaware for a while about these sort of deeper realizations that were going on about it's not so simple as like putting the native plants back is good, and propagating, and you know, I think that there's sort of an on or off kind of impulse that a lot of us have. Is like, what I'm doing endorsed or not endorsed? Is it good or bad? And before learning this extra layer, the plants were going in, and it is wonderful. I do want to say there's a lot of folks that say you can't do this kind of planting that's like open, sunny, indigenous planting in the Northwest in terms of like horticulture, and that's just not true. We've proven it ourselves in our backyards and sidewalk strips. We have incredible grasses here that can act as this sort of supportive matrix. Now they need to be managed, or else you'll have only grasses over time, and that's what our predecessors, our indigenous predecessors, know how to do, and we need to put that together. But primarily on the Burke site, we have Festuca romeri on the top and Deschampsia cespitosa on the bottom. Really stalwart grasses, a little bit adjusted to slightly different environments, and we hope that over time they'll choose where they want to be. But we kept it simple for weeding as well with those two grass species, easy to identify. And then we have, here's a photo of some of the beautiful plants from Oxbow waiting to go in the ground on the site in the middle of winter. This is what happens in modern construction projects. The plants are often, no matter what you plan, you want to plant them to go in the fall, they end up going in August or December. It's just the reality. But it's important to see how many plants went in. This is how we know we should all be planting. The folks that are a little ahead of us in the horticulture world in the Northeast, and with trying our best to get a little closer to what the way plants want to be, which is in communities and layers. We know that on average, they want to be about 8 to 12 inches apart. So here you get a sense, and Bridget, knows all the stats of how many plants, how many species, and mentioned it earlier. And then here you see those same plants a few months later, really vibrant. They're in the containers with the air pruned roots, which really helps their resiliency, and their roots are just like taken off and grabbing hold. And you can see lupinus doing its job of that early hero, kind of preparing and healing the soil for the rest of the guys and sheltering them as they're slowly coming in. And this is illustrating just the challenge of, when you have that many plants, you have a lot of feet and hands inevitably on the site, and soil compaction, especially if it's in a wet December. I'm going to hand it back to Polly.
So in March, we moved the plants, and we needed to finish the work that we started with the tribes and communities in a good way. So in conversation, we thought it would be great to plant the Camas with the communities in the Burke yard. So the staff, tribal communities, GGN, we could all get involved, and community members that are big supporters of the Burke Museum could get in and support and put their love and energy into the planting of the plant. So we came together, and once again, we shared some songs and acknowledgement that today we're bringing the plants in, we're welcoming them home. So these are our new babies coming to the new home, and we are going to put them in a ground in a good way, and wish them well to grow in a good way. Not all the tribes were able to show up that participated in the first part, but they did acknowledge they were doing the work from their own indigenous land, from their own homes and space. We had to do this. We had to finish this work. My elders have taught me that if you start work, you have to complete it to the end. And although the work started before we became involved, we were invited in and we were a part of the process to be able to help the plants come and thrive as we move them into the new Burke. I see a couple questions in there that are tribes going to be able to harvest the food or use the Camas as we move forward? We are in consultation with our Native American Advisory Board. We are going to be talking to the herbarium about what kind of projects can we create that could create some sustainable cooking or, processing opportunities with the Camas, but the programming has not been designed or figured out. Right now, what's important is to help these babies thrive and to help them establish themselves in the Burke yard. One of the positives of COVID is the fact that we aren't having visitors trampling in the garden and walking through haphazardly or just not thinking of really what is really happening within that yard and in the garden, and what the plants really mean to the people, because we still have to get our signage up and have other work to complete, information sharing with the communities that are going to be coming in and visiting. Next slide, Bridget. Oh, more planting.
So we see everyone joining in on planting.
Yeah. Yeah, so and this for us at Oxbow, because we had, I think this was actually in December. It was fairly late. We lucked out with the weather, but doing this as a community of different people that had come in, from different points along the way, and had supported this project in so many different ways, was really meaningful to us. And it was really interesting. I had, after experiencing all that the elders shared with us back in March at Oxbow, I had a lot of shifts in my mind about these plants. And I've planted a lot of plants over time, especially like a lot of like restoration type projects. And I just can honestly say this planting was the first time I felt such a strong connection to the plants and intention around that. And I feel really thankful to the Indigenous teachers that helped all of us kind of see that and make that shift in our mind. And it's a shift that I'm continuing to make and realize about. But it's like all of a sudden I realized the weight of like, we 5 years ago found these seeds and on a small island in the San Juan Islands, sort of living in their community that they had been living in for thousands of years. And like, we took them to this other place where they stayed, but was probably very unfamiliar to them, for 4 years, almost 5 years. And then now bringing them back to this place where some of those relationships can be rekindled, was really powerful. And just thinking like how transformative, like just landscaping, gardening, restoration in general would be, if we can kind of continue to shift our minds to think about the plants that way as they go, as we tend them in the nursery and as they go into the ground. And so the other thing that I think I really thought a lot about was how unusual this situation is. Like Polly said, how unusual it is to be taking seeds from somewhere, putting them in this artificial environment, and then putting them back in some other environment that we choose. And so really trying to think of how we move forward in a way that's respectful of what the plants need beyond the water that they need, the soil that they need, but the relationships that we need, and how we can try to create that in the nursery environment. I think there's a couple more pictures of just planting here. So we got to, I think it was just like 200 bulbs, but you can see they were ready to start. They were sprouting, and unbelievably, this next spring, this is spring 2019, we had some beautiful Camas coming up and blooming. And then I think we have some other beautiful pictures here of some of the other. There's our little showy fleabane, one of our native daisies, Erigeron speciosus, and then our big superstar of spring of 2019, Lupinus albicollis, just really is doing its job, adding nitrogen to the soil, breaking it up to make room for its friends around it. So we're gonna sort of end by talking about some of the important lessons that we learned from this process, even though we've already kind of been sprinkling them in, and then I think open it up for some questions at the end. So I'll turn it over to Polly.
Thank you. As I mentioned, you know, a big part of my work as a tribal liaison is to walk in two worlds. And I also need to be aware that although I walk in two worlds, I also make mistakes. And that in making mistakes, unintentionally harming tribal elders or the teachings that we have in the world and in our practices. The big lesson that was shared between the two ceremonies was that we broke the law of nature by farming the foods, and that you could not undo that. And how are you to move forward in a good way in the work and the intention of how our foods that we brought to the Burke Museum are to be used. I personally had to take cultural responsibility in that harm, and cultural responsibility in myself and how I was raised and where I was taught, who were my teachers, but also recognizing that that my elders and the community put me in this position. You know, they set me there because they knew I could take it, could take it from both sides of the world. And so being aware of my cultural responsibility, knowing the religious practices and how to take care of that. But for you, not all this information is available to the public. These are conversations that I personally have to have with the elders that is part of my teaching and my growth and my education as a cultural practitioner. And so although although I had this difficult conversation, I know I'm being informed so that I can do better next time when I have these conversations or we work on another project together per se, and be able to do that in a good way. Nature is the law. And I think that's a big lesson that you'll hear from my two panelist friends here, my plant sisters here. And traditional knowledge is always growing. And if we take a moment to listen to the plants and we sit and talk to them as well as to each other, they're going to provide you with information. The knowledge comes from the nourishment that they provide you, the smells that they give you when they flower, but as well as their journey in the world and how they migrate across the land. I have learned so much in this project, and I had to move too fast. And I just ask for more opportunities to be able to develop this knowledge sharing between the organizations and the students. What's really important about having access to traditional foods in the Burke Yard is that this provides cultural safety for Native students that come to the University of Washington. They will have access to these foods, we hope, through our gatherings that we have on campus. Our tribal elders will have a place to come and share their knowledge as on the inside of the museum through the collections, but as well as utilizing the Burke Yard as a classroom to share stories and information. But also just really indigenizing the space again. It's just really important to be able to do that as we all talk about changing relationships. What is decolonization? How do we heal from colonial harm? How do we colonial changes that harm Indigenous communities? And so we just keep trying. And I think that's just what was really important. And I want to pass this on to Bridget.
Thank you, Polly. So I guess I have just two overarching themes to my learnings, but they're continually unfolding and as time goes on. But one of the things that really struck me at the plant blessing, where the elders spoke to us about their relationship with the plants, is just this idea. You know, I heard words saying the plants sacrificed everything for us. We have a responsibility to the plants. Things that you would say about your friends, your family. And so to me, like this, and even though I've read, you know, things like these are Indigenous values and this is what Indigenous people think, it didn't like enter like into, I guess, into my heart until I heard the elders say that. And so just thinking about plants being our equals, like transforms everything that you do. And you know, there's just so many questions that I have about things that I do now and, you know, that I wrestle with. And I'm sure I'll always wrestle with, but I think the fact that that has been turned, that switch has been turned, that I am questioning. So like the idea of, you know, having a relationship with plants where, you know, the nursery where I work, we, you know, it is a very controlled environment. You know, plants are in these containers where they're, you know, all the same size. They get this, you know, they get watered at a certain time of the day. They're not next to, you know, not in a community of a bunch of different plants. And so it's very controlled. We have, you know, we have to grow this many plants by this time. We have like a deadline. We sell them for money, you know, so they're commodified. So it's really interesting to start sort of struggling with those questions. I don't have, you know, the answers, but just it really changes how you think about what you're doing to know these as persons versus as something other, you know, something apart from me or something separate. The second kind of big lesson that came from this is just the idea of humility, and always kind of, you know, bringing this back to thinking about, you know, living in this kind of world of botanists and scientists and gardeners, landscapers, native plant enthusiasts. It's a very you know, a lot of the meetings and presentations that I go to are largely white people. And so it's really interesting to think about, you know, the original people of these lands having thousands of years of knowledge and relationship with these plants. And then, you know, here's little old me, like being the expert and telling people, like, here's all the stuff that I know about Camas. I mean, you know, what do I know about Camas? And so it's really humbling, not that I can't speak for it and, you know, and speak to what I know, but it's that kind of put me in a different mindset, in like knowing how much there is left for me to know and internalize and understand. And the other thing that really, I think, and Polly has helped me see a lot too, is just that healing through all of these different things that have happened over the years, violent acts, misunderstandings, you know, all this like range of things that have caused hurt. It's not a clear and easy path. There's not something that we can, like, if we just do this, everything's going to be okay. It's, you know, we'll all be working on this for all of our lives, and just knowing that we have each other to work through this with, again, humbles me. It humbles me and gives me so much humility to hear Polly talk about her mistakes, and to hear Shannon talk about her mistakes. And so I think we really give strength to each other, I think, through this process. So yeah, I'll turn it over to Shannon.
Thanks. So I had 2 lessons and 2 questions. I had many, actually more, but I'm going to try to be brief. The first one actually was spurred by, I went to an event. It was around the opening, and it was with, Polly was there. And Polly came up to me. I was going to have some speaking part. She probably could tell I was nervous. And somehow clairvoyantly, she had this, I could tell she knew I needed to hear this story. And it is a creation story about plants one by one, including evergreen huckleberry, including salal, all deciding one by one how they are going to help these poor people, these poor humans, and enter into an agreement with the humans to help them at certain times of year and in the way that they sustain life and are really central to survival. And it was one of those things I'd heard and read, just like Bridget said, I'd read some of these stories before and felt like I was educating myself about these creation stories and indigenous stories of my region. But I'd never had somebody look me in the eye and say that to me before. And Polly even went so far as, I remember you'd said to somebody else, "Oh, don't worry, I just blew her mind." And then you walked away. And I don't even think I knew my mind had been blown yet till about 30 seconds later. And it really did. I think the main thing for me is realizing that as somebody who I'm a sensitive person, I really believe in making life fair. And so for me, it's been this injustice that these helpless plants have been displaced by, people being selfish. So I'm seeing myself in this role of righting wrongs, and I'm helping these helpless plants by putting them back into these, and I'm marketing them and saying, look how beautiful they are, these poor plants. I did have my mind completely blown, and I honestly think about it almost every night, that I do not know what I'm dealing with. I had no idea. These plants are powerful patrons, and they're in mutual agreements and exchanges with people that stretch for thousands and thousands of years. Well-trodden territory and deep, almost like the wiring in the air around us that I didn't see here until some of these brief ceremonies that I was so honored to be part of, and until Polly looked me in the eye and told me that story. You read about the importance of oral communication about these things. I completely believe that now, because it changed the wiring of my mind. I do not think that I'm dealing with these poor things in this charity case anymore, and I'm being altruistic. I'm dealing with powerful beings, and I better watch it. And then the second big lesson, as a landscape architect, I don't call what I do restoration, because I get hung up with all the hand-wringing of, oh, well, what was the species count on this particular site? Or the thing that we all do, often when we're scared of change, of saying, well, what's native anyway? And all those like little semantic arguments. At this Camas blessing ceremony that we showed you earlier, Connie McLeod, in her remarks, she said something simple, but again, mind-blowing to me. She said, this is a restoration. These plants have always been here. And she went on to say something about they have been waiting. They knew this was happening. They've been waiting. They've been here for thousands of years. Of course they're here. And that made me realize that I've been petty, I've been self-conscious, and I've been vain by not calling what I do restoration. Restoration is just a rational and moral name for putting something back that was there before you and transcends the scale of what you do. It's the right thing to do, to put these plants back into their agreements and into their communities. That was a big shifter for me. Don't have time to argue about restoration term anymore. And then there were two questions, and we can either talk about this, or maybe these are things that can kind of get discussion going. I know there's a lot of questions building up in Q&A as well, but I think that, what these kind of start to point to is how can non-Indigenous people like myself we need to educate ourselves. We need to increase our understanding of these plants and the ancient agreements they have with their communities, with their families. That again, it's this giant under our feet, and we only know how to research the curtain that's covering it up. How do we do that without violating sacred agreements, violating the last protection that's left from us for these agreements, and not commit really cultural plagiarism? That's a real, I don't know that there's necessarily an answer for this. Back to Bridget and Polly both said, we're going to be working on this for a long time, but we need to start. We need to start figuring this out. And as a landscape architect, I know I need to start figuring it out.
I think one of the important lessons in that question, and the important thing, Shannon, is if you heard the timeline of the project, we need to be brought in at the beginning of the project in order for the understanding and the shared knowledge and the important opportunities that happen in relationship, and the important lessons and stories that are being told can really be deeper and authentic, not just a public event when I grab your shoulders and tell you a story, or 6 months before you bring the plants in. What happens in Indian country and tribal communities is we're thought about being brought to the table when the table's already been served, or maybe even the meal's already been half eaten, as an example, right? Rather than bringing us in to help prepare the menu and develop, the whole event. I'll pause there.
We've all lived that sequence that you just described. We got to break out of it. And there's one more question that's sort of like this hanging question that this project has gifted me with. So it's in the theme of learning. Okay, we want to educate ourselves. We want to learn more. We need to learn how to do this. We need to learn how to do these landscapes. The Pacific Northwest ranks at the bottom with Florida, for the lowest percentage of native plant commerce, like the native plants in our nurseries, the native plants that are sold, the native plants that go in the ground. So, what's the deal? Well, we're behind. We're young, and I don't know, insecure. We're still importing our horticulture. We work in a lot of different regions, Gigia does, and I'm always perplexed when I come home and see that. So we need to learn how to do this. It's not every single region has gone through this. Like, you can't do this with our native plants. Yes, you can. You just need to learn about them. But to learn about them, we need to study them. To study means different things to different folks. And the process of using westernized science, we need to do more of that to respect, to equalize the resources available. But sometimes that can cause pain. And that's an insight that I've been learning from this project, because I've been gung-ho about creating and encouraging more westernized resources, and kind of like equal amounts of the same kinds of resources we use to design and plant with indigenous plants in other regions. this is along the lines of the plants in the containers being, it's for good, but there's an artificiality there, or a sort of out of world, out of body disconnection that's there, that we haven't all been necessarily appreciating how traumatic that can be for Indigenous people. And the studying can be as well, quantifying and things like that. So there's a different kind of learning that we need to do that we tend to skip over. That's an open-ended question that we thought we'd put out there. And we also thought we'd put out there some resources that are available. I understand this will be recorded, but I'm sorry about web links on a webinar, but the Burke Museum has a wonderful, it's a wonderful website in general, and a wonderful place in general to go to learn about our nature and culture of this place today. And I'm really excited by what they're doing. And there's a website that has all the plants. Like if you're interested in the plant lists for this project, they're on the Burke's website. Oxbow has information on their website. We have some photos on our website of the project, and talks about a little more about the grading in the urban context. And then I also wanted to encourage folks to stay involved with WNPS because they're hosting more and more interesting conversations and connections, intersectional conversations like this in our region. Did Bridget or Polly, you want to say anything else before we open it up to questions?
Before we go into questions, just to thank everybody, thank the Native Plant Society for inviting us to do this, and thank everyone for listening, and then just a big thank you to Polly and Shannon for being such wonderful teammates on this.
Thank you.
Okay, well, this is Elizabeth Gage speaking. I'm the office coordinator at WNPS, and I'm going to be helping us go through some of the many questions that people have asked. I've tried to group them into some topics that recurred several times. Camas had a lot of interest, and one of the questions a couple of people asked, Jean Davis and somebody else, was whether the Burke Camas will be harvested by the tribes at any point.
We hope so, or at least by the students, the First Nation students on campus. They have a couple of food gatherings that this would be a perfect resource to bring to their table over at the Intellectual House, Alt. So it would be a nice resource to share with them.
Great, thank you. Another question about Camas was, Rob Stevens noticed that you had planted or included meadow death Camas, and he wondered if that was to discourage illicit harvesting.
That would be one way to do it. We did include it, and it's part of the community of plants, and it's part of the wisdom of our predecessors, and how these places were managed, as you probably know. When Camas is harvested at the traditional stage, it's really obvious which is which. It's easy for me to say because I didn't grow up doing it. I've only been experimenting with it myself in recent years. But the wisdom of the folks who will be managing the education here is being relied upon and absolutely trusted with the inclusion of that plant, which is also an important ecological plant for insects.
Thank you. I'd actually like to back up just a moment and express my gratitude to the three of you, but also to the elders who are holding us as we stumble in this new direction. I'm very grateful for that. A couple of people asked where can they obtain Camas, and I would like to answer that partly myself and say that our website has a section called Plants, which includes resources including a native plant and seed source list. So depending on where you are, you can consult that for a nursery near you. But maybe Bridget would like to, or any of the others of you would like to contribute to that answer.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, the WNPS website has a good list of places where you can get Camas. We're restocking our supplies after after that growing. So we will have some in future years at Oxbow, but there's a lot of great nurseries in the state of Washington. One of them that maybe is convenient for folks is Fourth Corner Nursery up in Bellingham because they can ship them to you. But there's a lot of, and in the spring, Native Plant Society has what I think is the best plant sale ever because there's just so many different things available. So there's a lot of options. I think our conservation districts plant sales that they have them in March, but you can pre-order stuff like back in December. I believe they have Camas sometimes at those as well. So those are a couple suggestions.
I'd put a shout out to Northwest Meadowscapes. They now have Camassia quamash bulbs. You can get the seeds, but Bridget told you how patient you need to be. But they have quamash, the shorter and more drought tolerant or more sort of a dry meadow camas. And in bulbs, so that's a little more instant gratification. And then actually tulips.com, which I can't remember it's one of the Mount Vernon bulb growers, now has like linei. It's in the like other specialty bulb section, but just to let you know that if you're looking at, more quantities.
Thank you. Barbara Broderick wondered if you had any problems with rabbits.
Oh yeah, the Eastern Cottontails. Yes, we've had problems with rabbits everywhere. And if you go to the Burke Museum right now, you'll scare up a few.
Thank you. Jackie Agee wondered at a certain slide whether the planting density was how that was planned, or whether it was a way of counting on the plant community to keep each other in check and not have any one thing take over. I hope I understood that question right.
Yeah, I could take that one too, and welcome anybody else to chime in. It might be sort of all of those things. In an artificial planting like this, the odds are always against us a little bit because it's a tough thing to transplant all these plants at the same time into this tough situation. So we want to cover the ground as quickly as possible to shade out the invasive weeds that are constantly invading, airborne, rhizomes, everything. So we need to cover the ground quickly. Otherwise, we have to do the strategy where you have the dotted plants in the sea of beauty bark that's like the weed suppressing mat. And we wanted a community of plants here that are intermingling. So a reference you can think of, like kind of a more garden or horticultural technique that is actually fairly relevant in restoration kind of plantings, is the now it's P. Udolph, the grass matrix approach, where we make sure the ground is shaded, like we plant the grasses so that they can kind of cover the ground, shade it, compete. You need some things in there that compete with the weeds. And then we have different seasonal plants, a little more ephemeral, that come up through the grasses. And this is what we tend to see in nature as well, to some degree. And we are unfortunately limited to one planting. We don't have, it's not like we're coming in and planting every 2 years here. And that's something that needs to change about the landscape architecture and contracting industry in general. And I will stop myself from getting started on that. But we have one planting. And we want these plants to, as a community, we're putting the plants in, like the lupinus, that we know they're going to be dominant at first. Then they're not going to be as dominant. The grasses and the achillea that we have in there, the yarrow, is going to start to take over in a good way, but they take a little longer to get started. And they're aided by the achillea. Some of the asters and slow things like Sedalcia, they're going to take longer to develop. The checker mallow. We have those all packed in there. And we also don't expect that it's going to look a certain way. We're going to see how the plants choose to sort of interact and take turns and phase themselves. Part of it is by necessity that we have this one planting to set this community up that we hope will work things out amongst themselves based on also the little micro conditions that we can't expect to predict. There's going to be little drier areas and little moister areas within any site, and just little things that happen, light reflecting off of windows and things like that. So the more diversity we can get in there, the better. I hope that answered it to some degree.
Thank you. Several people, John Lisinski, Ken Gifford, and Sheila Tuck, asked versions of the question about how you prepared the soil, remarking that in parts it looked very sandy.
It is very sandy. It's a pretty sandy site. It was when we started, and we don't know exactly how much of that was the original soil, although on soil maps it's part of that Indianola kind of blonde sandy soil type. We didn't put a lot of organic amendment in there. So you're right, it doesn't look like a typical, like, come in and do the 6-inch lifts for 18 or 24 inches of rich soil. We did our best to plant, to put plants into this Camas meadow. There's more organic material and mulch kind of tined and blended into the other areas of the site I should mention. But the Camas meadow, we did our best to plant a kind of colonizing community that tends to occur in poorer soils. There's some exceptions to that. We included both of the species of Camas. So we have Camas and we also have like Linii. Like Linii, according to things that I've been able to access, tends to occur in slightly richer and deeper soils. It still seems to be, it's kind of done okay any place I put it, but it seems to be doing okay here so far. But our industry seems to be moving a little bit more toward amending soils less and trying to plant more toward what's there. And we're trying to learn as we go with that.
Thank you. A couple of people also asked, how can they take these lessons into their home garden? And how can we best honor native plants and native ecology and native practices in planning our gardens at home?
Welcome to our journey. I feel that responding from my perspective, it's you have to establish a relationship with the plants and ask them for permission to come to your garden, ask them permission to provide you nutrients, and just develop that loving relationship. Maybe similar to, just riffing right now, but how you treat your house plants. Bridget, you want to add something to that?
No, I think that's great. I think also I've found myself over time, I mean, maybe your garden is one of the best places to get to know these plants. Really, I find myself over time spending more time with my plants at home than like going on hikes to see plants, because I feel like the ones that I have at home I know, and I see them throughout the seasons, and I see how they change. So I mean, maybe that is one of the best ways that you can get to know them. I don't know if that's just a thought.
I agree. Just got to start and watch them.
It's okay to talk to your plants, you know. I've been up picking huckleberries the past few weeks, and just being in the mountains even, and like we said, on hikes, just acknowledging and sharing gratitude for, you know, the harvest and for the time that you get to spend touching them. You know, in this time of COVID, especially right now, we don't have intimacy with the broader community. And so for me, that was medicine. That was healing for me, to connect with the huckleberries in a different way, because that intimacy is guarded now with masks and with 6 feet and with all of these other rules that we have. So it's just walking in the world with a different skip.
Thank you. A couple of people have asked about plant lists and other resources, and I think we showed you the websites as the last slide, and this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our WNPS.org website. We have a section for virtual programming on the front page. I don't want to promise when this particular presentation will be available, but as soon as possible. So start checking early next week, I would say. Another thing you can do, I have a very simple email address. It's info@WNPS.org. If you have a question that isn't answered on one of these websites, or would like me to pass a question on to one of our panelists, I'll be happy to do so. So once again, that was info@WNPS.org. Let's see. Oh, here's a, Catherine Graham asks, has there been any discussion among our committees and network to make planting natives rather than imported plants more desirable to developers after construction takes place in the state? So this is something that WNPS has on its mind all the time, but I don't know if there's any more targeted and focused activity going on.
Could I say that I think the clients, like my clients, developers, tech companies, to be competitive with their projects, they are totally ahead of the provider industry on this. They are, what I'm seeing is that they are ready for it. They're asking for it. The landscape architects that are on here, like if you can, you know, start experimenting in your backyard, you know, get the knowledge, because it's kind of what you have to do. I think that it's where things are going in terms of what people are looking for. People want, especially younger people, want authenticity in their environment. And I think this is a little bit almost callous or something, or cynical, like marketing cynical. But I think we all can connect with that. We need to connect to it in a way that transcends the sort of, market force aspect of it, which is about like branding with authenticity, and make sure that the cultural depth and living connections with the people who are part of our community are honored and consulted. But I would say clients are ready for it, and they just need resources and help, and they need the services, and there's not enough folks providing the services for native planting and development.
Great, thank you. That's encouraging in a way. Another question, where will the lessons learned from growing, tending these plants be published online? So I don't know if the lessons will be available at some place on the Burke website, or if there's any plans to do that.
I don't know. That's a good question. I guess we haven't really thought about that or discussed that. I mean, I think this talk will be available online, and is a place that we could send people. But I don't know. I think that would be a good discussion for us to have, if there's an additional way that we can get that information out to folks. And I mean, it would be even interesting to sort of flip that as a way that inviting other people to share their lessons learned and going on similar journeys. So it's not a great answer, but I don't know what the answer is.
Another related question is whether any of the lessons or testimonials or comments included in your talk tonight will be incorporated into the exhibits at the Burke, into the interpretation of the exhibits in the signage and so forth.
There are stories and connections, tribal stories within the museum in different parts of the gallery. You'll have to be aware of them. There's not arrows pointing to the stories. I think there's all kinds of intersectionality between all of the galleries that happen within the Burke.
Great, I can't wait to get in there.
Yeah, the curators have done a great job.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep.
So a person asks, were there any planting failures?
Always. Yes. We have right now, we're looking at too much mortality in the broadleaf evergreen woody plants on the site. They tend to be the ones that we are concerned about. So the Guthrie, the Salal, and the Vaccinum ovatum, the evergreen huckleberry. They're both really robust plants once established. So much of their life is underground for both of them in different ways. And getting them established with enough shelter, enough irrigation, like just a lot of irrigation during their formative weeks and months, especially if they didn't have the chance to do some root healing and setting over the entirety of the fall and winter before they got hit with summer, which, remember, these got planted December, January, midwinter. So, they went into like really cold ground, traumatic event. They'd been sitting there for a while. And again, this isn't unusual for an artificial, installation to be sort of affected by these forces. But those woody Ericaceae, I probably said that wrong, plants, in my experience, are most vulnerable to that. Once they get established, it's hard to stop them. They're incredibly strong but we're dealing with too much mortality with those guys.
Thank you. I think I've covered pretty much all the questions that people put in either the chat or the Q&A. And I would like to thank our panelists again for, well, yes, mind-blowing, or at least mind-opening presentation, lots to think about. And I would like to thank all of our over 100 attendees who are still with us. It got up to almost 200 at one point. So thank you very much for your interest. And I will see if Denise would like to say anything in closing, and wish you all a very good night.
I'll just say thank you all. I will move next to recording. I'm amazed at your work. Thank you for the gifts that you've brought to this place in Seattle. And I look forward to hearing more stories as it impacts the people. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. I will move on to edit this video and have it ready for posting. As Elizabeth said, there's a direct link on our homepage. And we will send out one follow-up email. And perhaps I can get the link in there if I work quick. But it's not a quick process, so thank you for your patience. Good night, everybody.
Good night and thank
everybody.
you.
Great job.
Bye.
Lovely talk. Thank you.
Really nice.
Drive safe, Bridget. Bye.
You, bye.
Bye.
Bridget's in a dark greenhouse. Thank you, Yanka.
Thanks, Yanka.
Thank you. Night.
Good night, Denise. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Elizabeth. Thank you. Nice job with the questions.
Thank you.